If you've ever dealt with a power-hungry HOA Karen, you'll want to hear this story to the very end, because what started as a simple refusal to join an HOA turned into a full-blown police call, humiliation, and the ultimate twist that she never saw coming. And before I even dive into it, make sure you stick around, because the way she froze when she realized who I really was is something you won't want to miss. So hit that subscribe button for more HOA Karen stories like this one, because it's about to get wild. And it all began on a cool summer morning at my lakeside property, where I was enjoying the peace and quiet of a place I had bought years ago as my personal getaway, a retreat away from the noise of the city. And that very morning, I was preparing the dock for a few friends who were coming over for a weekend barbecue when I noticed a sharp-looking woman marching down the gravel path that led from the public road toward my land, her expression locked in that familiar scowl you've probably seen on every HOA Karen before, her eyes squinting as if she were a sheriff surveying her territory. But the problem was, this wasn't her territory at all. And yet she acted like she owned the whole lakefront, storming right past the sign that clearly read private property, no trespassing, and she walked straight toward me without so much as a greeting, planting herself right in front of me with her arms crossed and saying, "You must be the new guy on the lake, and I need to have a word with you about the HOA." And the way she said it made it clear she wasn't asking, but demanding. And I paused for a second, set down the rope I was coiling, and replied politely, "Actually, I'm not part of any HOA here. This land is private and has nothing to do with your association." But that only seemed to ignite her further, because she huffed, pulled a clipboard out of the oversized bag she carried, and shoved a paper in my face saying, "Everyone on. This lake is required to join. No exceptions. We have rules here, sir. We expect compliance." And that was when I took a step back, smiled a little, and said, "Ma'am, I think you're mistaken. This land was purchased long before your HOA even existed. The deed makes it very clear my property is not part of your jurisdiction." And the way her face twisted when I said that told me I had just poked the bear, because she narrowed her eyes, jabbed a finger toward me, and said, "Listen here, young man. You may think you can skirt the rules, but the HOA owns this lake, and if you want to keep using it, you'll have to pay dues and follow the regulations. Otherwise, I'll make sure you regret it." And I couldn't help but chuckle, because it was almost entertaining to watch her puff herself up with authority she didn't actually have. But before I could reply, she kept rambling about her long list of HOA rules. Everything from dock maintenance fees to guest limitations to what color I was allowed to paint my boathouse. And I finally cut in and said, "I don't think you're hearing me. This is my private land, and I am not now, nor will I ever be, under your HOA." And she gasped, as if I had just insulted royalty, clutching her clipboard to her chest and sputtering, "You can't just refuse. It's mandatory. And if you won't listen to me, I'll have to take this up with the authorities." And I shrugged, replying calmly, "Do what you need to do, but you're trespassing right now, and I'd like you to leave my property." And the fury in her eyes at being dismissed like that was almost comical, but instead of leaving, she stomped her heel into the gravel, pulled out her phone, and with a theatrical flourish, started dialing 911 right in front of me, saying, loudly enough for the birds across the water to hear, "Yes, I'd like to report a trespasser and a hostile homeowner refusing to comply with our HOA rules." I actually laughed out loud, which only made her angrier, because while she was spinning lies into the phone, I stood there leaning against my dock railing, completely calm, because I knew the police showing up would work out just fine for me, since I had nothing to hide. And the funniest part was, she didn't even realize the weight of the mistake she was making, not only because she was completely wrong about the HOA's authority over my property, but because she had no clue who I really was. The truth was going to hit her harder than she ever imagined. But I decided to let her dig her own hole, so I watched her rant into the phone, pretending to be the hero of the neighborhood, barking out my address as if it were part of her domain. And when she hung up, she smirked triumphantly at me, saying, "You're going to learn today that no one defies me or the HOA, not without consequences." And I just smiled back and said, "Will." See, because in my mind, this was just the opening act of a much larger showdown. One where her arrogance and her need for control were about to collide headfirst with the reality of who actually owned this land and who actually had the power here. Why? And as I looked out across the sparkling water of the lake, I couldn't help but think to myself, this was going to be one of those stories that people wouldn't believe unless they saw it happen. And little did Karen know, by the time the cops arrived, the entire balance of power was going to flip, and her reign of intimidation over this lake community was about to crumble, and all I had to do was stand firm and let the truth do the work. The moment the officers left, Karen stood there fuming on my front porch as if she had just been robbed of her victory. I could almost see the steam rising off her shoulders. But I simply walked back inside, refusing to give her the satisfaction of more confrontation, and poured myself a glass of water while replaying the entire scene in my head, realizing that this woman had just tried to weaponize the police against me without knowing she had called them on her own landlord. It was only a matter of time before the truth would shatter the image of power she carried around like a badge of honor. Though for now I let her stew in her own rage, confident that her ignorance would eventually catch up with her. But as the days passed, I could see her determination grow instead of wither. Because Karen wasn't the kind of person who gave up easily, especially when she thought authority was on her side. So she doubled down, showing up at my door with HOA forms, walking around my lakefront property with a clipboard in hand, and trying to intimidate my guests whenever they came over, barking orders as if she had the right to dictate how people behaved on my land. And the sheer arrogance of it all made me realize that she wasn't going to stop until she was forced to face the truth. Though I decided it would be far more satisfying to let her push herself into a corner before I revealed everything, so I stayed patient, documenting her every move, collecting evidence of her harassment, and quietly preparing for the moment when I could put her in her place for good. It wasn't long before Karen escalated things even further, because one Friday evening when a couple of my old college friends drove up to spend the weekend fishing and relaxing, she stormed down from her oversized lake house in her usual loud, floral dress, clutching her phone like a weapon and demanding to know if they had registered with the HOA, which caused my friends to burst out laughing because the idea of registering with a self-appointed committee before enjoying a weekend on my private lake sounded absurd to them. But Karen didn't see it that way. She began yelling that this was community property and that no outsiders were allowed without board approval. And when I calmly reminded her that this was my private land and my invited guests, she jabbed her finger in my face, screaming that she would have them removed by force if necessary, dialing the police once again and pacing back and forth like a guard dog waiting to attack, while my friends exchanged amused looks, whispering that I seemed to have quite the neighborhood entertainment system built into the property, though. I couldn't ignore the way Karen's influence was starting to rattle some of the other residents who had drifted over to watch the commotion, nodding along as she barked about rules and fees and how I was a danger to the peace of the community. And I knew then that she had been poisoning their ears for weeks, planting lies about me refusing to join, refusing to pay, and acting like I was some kind of freeloader, when in reality, the land she was trying to claim as her HOA's dominion was the very ground she leased her house upon. And that fact was going to sting her worse than anything else when it finally came. Out. The police did arrive, just like she promised, but this time they seemed less interested in her complaints. Probably because the last visit had left them looking foolish. And one officer even told her flatly that they had no jurisdiction over private land disputes, which only made her shriek louder about trespassing, disorderly conduct, and even environmental violations because she saw beer cans near the fire pit. Though none of those claims held water, and when the officers finally told her that if she didn't calm down, she'd be the one facing charges for disturbing the peace, she snapped her mouth shut and stormed off, muttering under her breath about calling county enforcement instead. And I knew then that this wasn't the end. She was going to drag this fight through every level of bureaucracy she could think of before admitting defeat. That night, as my friends and I sat by the lake under the stars, one of them asked why I hadn't just told her the truth yet, why I hadn't revealed that I owned the land, her house, and half the lots surrounding the lake, and I admitted that. It wasn't just about ending the nonsense, It was about teaching Karen a lesson she would never forget, because if I told her too soon, she would just switch tactics, maybe even apologize, and try to weasel her way out of the humiliation. But if I let her build herself up into a storm of self-righteous fury, her eventual collapse would be so spectacular that no one in the neighborhood would ever take her seriously again. And that was the kind of justice that couldn't be rushed. Over the next week, Karen went into overdrive, leaving pamphlets in everyone's mailbox about a mandatory HOA meeting to vote on imposing new restrictions around the lake, walking door to door to recruit allies, and even showing up at my cabin with 2 men she claimed were part of the compliance committee, demanding to inspect my dock for safety violations, though when I laughed and told them to leave, Karen snapped that known compliance would result in fines, waving around a stack of papers that looked suspiciously like something she had typed up on her home printer, and the men, who seemed more like her gullible neighbors than any real authority, shuffled awkwardly until I told them to step 1 foot on my property and I'd call the sheriff myself, which finally made them back off, though Karen's glare could have set the whole cabin on fire. The breaking point came a few days later when she tried to stop a local family who rented one of my cabins for the weekend from launching their kayak onto the lake, standing in front of them like a guard at a fortress and shouting that only members were allowed water access, which ended in the father of the family calling me directly, furious that his vacation was being ruined by some random woman pretending to be in charge. And I had to drive over immediately to defuse the situation, arriving just in time to see Karen recording the family on her phone, telling them she would have them escorted off the lake if they didn't comply, and when I stepped between them and told her to leave, she sneered that she had already called Lake Patrol and that my little rental scheme was about to be shut down permanently. And that was the moment I realized Karen had no bottom, no limit to how far she'd go to impose herself on others. And if I didn't shut her down soon, she could actually scare off the guests who made up part of my income, or worse, provoke someone into a real altercation. That night, I sat at my desk, going through the lease agreements for Karen's house and the surrounding properties, pulling out the official documents with my name on them as the landowner, and I decided it was time to end this charade, not with yelling, not with threats, but with the cold, hard truth delivered in front of everyone. She had rallied to her side, because nothing would destroy her credibility more effectively than exposing her hypocrisy in the same public setting she used to build herself up. So, I circled the date of her so-called mandatory HOA meeting on my calendar, knowing that would be the day Karen's little empire crumbled around her. The next few weeks unfolded in a way that I could only describe as both surreal and exhausting, with Karen doubling down on her crusade to make my life as difficult as possible, even though she had unknowingly been fighting against her own landlord. All along, after the incident where she called the cops and they quickly realized that she had no authority over me, she became even more aggressive, trying to prove her dominance to her HOA board and her clique of loyal neighbors who seemed to treat her every word as gospel. She began mailing me absurd letters demanding that I voluntarily sign HOA membership forms, attaching fake fines for known compliance, and even threatened that my guests would be banned from using the lake. I found myself laughing at the absurdity, but I also knew that this wasn't something I could just ignore forever. People like Karen thrived on persistence, and unless you cut them off at the root, they would keep coming back stronger each time. One Saturday afternoon, as I was preparing for a small gathering by the lake with some friends, Karen showed up uninvited, storming down the hill with a clipboard in hand and that same fake badge clipped to her polo shirt, trying once again to play the role of an authority figure. She immediately started shouting at my guests to pack up their things and leave, claiming that the HOA had exclusive rights to the lake and that 9 HOA members were trespassing. The irony was so thick I could barely keep a straight face. I walked up to her, keeping calm, and in front of everyone, I repeated what I had told her before. This was my private land. The lake was part of my deed, and she had no authority to tell anyone here what to do. She snapped back with threats of more fines and lawsuits, waving her clipboard like it was some kind of holy decree. That was when I decided to go for the knockout punch. I looked her dead in the eye and said, "Karen, I don't think you realize who you're talking to. You keep threatening to fine me, but you don't understand that I am your landlord. The HOA office, the clubhouse, the streets you maintain, they all sit on parcels that I own and lease to your HOA. You want to keep pushing this game? Go ahead, but you're already standing on my land right now. The look on her face was priceless. For a split second, her confidence evaporated, and she froze in place, her mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. The crowd of my guests, who had been watching with amusement, burst into laughter at her stunned silence. Karen quickly tried to recover, insisting that I was bluffing and that her HOA had full jurisdiction. I didn't even argue. I simply walked inside my cabin, pulled out the lease documents and property maps I had kept neatly organized, and brought them outside for everyone to see. I showed the section of the deed that outlined my ownership of the lake and surrounding land, as well as the lease agreement signed by the HOA that clearly identified me as the landlord. Karen's face turned pale, and for the first time since I met her, she had nothing to say. She grabbed her clipboard, muttered something under her breath about needing to verify, and stormed off in humiliation. But the war wasn't over yet. Over the next few days, Karen began quietly whispering rumors around the neighborhood, telling people that I had forged documents, that was some kind of fraud, and that the HOA was launching an investigation into my ownership. She didn't realize that her lies only weakened her credibility further, because every HOA board member already knew the truth. They had been paying me rent for years. I had had the signed contracts to prove it. One board member, an older gentleman named Robert, even called me personally to apologize for Karen's behavior. He admitted that many of the members had grown tired of her antics, but were too intimidated to stand up to her, and he encouraged me to take whatever action I thought necessary to put her in her place. That phone call gave me an idea. Instead of simply waiting for Karen to dig her own grave, I would speed up the process by showing the HOA community the truth in a way that couldn't be denied. I arranged a meeting with the board, something I had the right to do as their landlord, and prepared a presentation with all the legal documents, maps, and lease agreements laid out in black and white. The night of the meeting, Karen was there, sitting at the head of the table with her arms crossed, clearly expecting me to back down or be humiliated. But as I began going through the documents, explaining my ownership and the terms of the lease, the entire board sat in stunned silence. Every time Karen tried to interrupt, I simply turned the page and showed yet another piece of evidence. By the time I was finished, the room was buzzing with whispers, and the board members were glaring at Karen with obvious frustration. One even asked her directly why she had been harassing me when she knew full well who I was. Spin a story about how she was protecting the community and that she didn't know the extent of my involvement. But it was too late. The damage was done. The board thanked me for coming, apologized again for her behavior, and assured me that they would handle things internally. But I knew Karen wasn't the type to quit quietly. She still had her pride, and people like her would rather go down swinging than admit defeat. True to form, the very next day, I saw her marching around the neighborhood with her little group of loyalists, trying to rally support against me. They put up flyers accusing me of trying to destroy the HOA, claiming that I was plotting to evict them all and turn the land into some kind of commercial development. It was laughable, but also pathetic. Neighbors began approaching me privately, asking if the rumors were true. I calmly explained the reality. Their HOA's existence depended on me. I had no intention of evicting anyone as long as they paid rent, and I simply wanted to be left alone to enjoy my land without harassment. Most of them believed me immediately, and I could see the doubt growing about Karen's leadership. One by one, her followers began to distance themselves, realizing that aligning with her was only going to cause more problems. The more desperate she got, the more unhinged her behavior became. She started showing up at my property unannounced, sometimes late at night, yelling at me from the street or leaving passive-aggressive notes taped to my mailbox. At one point, she even called the cops again, this time claiming that I was hosting illegal parties at the lake. When the officers arrived and saw nothing but a quiet evening with a couple of friends grilling by the water, they shook their heads, apologized for the inconvenience, and warned her that filing false reports could land her in serious trouble. That moment marked the beginning of her downfall. because now it wasn't just me who was tired of her. It was the entire neighborhood, the board, and even the police. But in her mind, she still thought she could win, and I knew she was about to do something reckless. And I was ready for it, because I had already begun preparing my final move, the one that would show Karen once and for all that she had picked the wrong person to fight with. Karen's frustration only seemed to deepen as the days passed. And while I had initially thought that the confrontation with the police and the embarrassing realization that she was dealing with her own landlord would have humbled her, it seemed to have had the opposite effect. Karen was more determined than ever to prove she had authority. She was willing to use every ounce of cunning and manipulation she could muster to try and undermine me. By now, my patience with her antics was worn thin, but I had resolved to handle this battle not with anger or rashness, but with strategy, because Karen's mistakes came from her arrogance. And arrogance always left openings for those paying attention. A week after the police incident, I invited a couple of friends and their families to spend the weekend at the lake. It was one of those gatherings I cherished, where kids could fish from the dock, the adults could share stories over a fire pit, and the calm of the water offered the kind of peace you couldn't buy in any city. But sure enough, Karen made her appearance. She stormed down the trail from her property line, clipboard in hand, and tried to address my guests as if she had some kind of authority over them. She shouted that they needed to check in with the Lake Association office and that no one was allowed on the property without HOA approval. My guests, confused and slightly alarmed, looked to me for guidance, and I simply stood up from my chair, walked over to Karen, and calmly reminded her in front of everyone that this was private property, my property, and that she had no jurisdiction here whatsoever. The look on her face when my friends asked her, "Are you serious? You don't even own this land?" was priceless. She huffed, sputtered, and stormed back off, muttering threats about legal consequences and community rules under her breath. My guests laughed about it later, but I could tell from the way Karen lingered at the property line afterward, glaring like a hawk, that she was already plotting her next move. Her retaliation came in the form of paperwork. A few days later, I received a letter in the mail stamped with what looked like an official HOA seal. The letter claimed that I owed several $1,000s in back dues and community upkeep fees, along with penalties for noncompliance. Karen had even gone so far as to include threats of liens and foreclosure if I didn't pay within 30 days. The whole thing would have been comical if it hadn't been for the fact that someone less informed might have been intimidated into paying. But I knew the law, and I knew HOAs only had authority over properties that were legally within their domain. My land, as I had confirmed many times, was exempt. Instead of confronting Karen immediately, I decided to let her dig herself deeper. I forwarded the letter to my attorney, who specialized in property law, and he confirmed what I already knew. The document was fraudulent, and Karen had overstepped her bounds in a way now that could have real legal consequences for her. He advised me to sit tight, collect all evidence of her harassment, and prepare to file a formal complaint. What Karen didn't realize was that she had just crossed a line from being a nuisance to committing fraud. Meanwhile, Karen escalated her efforts in more aggressive ways. She began patrolling the lakeshore, acting like some kind of self-appointed security guard. She harassed delivery drivers coming to my cabin, demanded they check in with her before dropping packages, and even once tried to block my driveway with her SUV, claiming that association members had a right to approve traffic in and out of the community. I called the sheriff that time, and while Karen tried to argue her case with the responding deputy, she was quickly reminded that blocking a private driveway was illegal. The deputy gave her a warning, but I could see the simmering anger in her eyes as she drove off. Karen was losing control of the narrative, and she hated it. The harder she tried to tighten her grip on the situation, the more ridiculous she appeared, not just to me, but to her neighbors as well. Word was starting to spread around the lake about Karen's behavior. Some of the other homeowners began quietly approaching me, expressing their own frustrations with her. One elderly couple told me that Karen had fined them for painting their mailbox without pre-approval. Another young family admitted that Karen constantly harassed their children for playing too loudly outside. People were fed up, but they were afraid to speak up because Karen had a way of intimidating anyone who opposed her. I realized then that my battle with Karen wasn't just personal anymore, it was part of a much larger pattern. She had been ruling over this community like a tyrant, and my refusal to bow to her authority had given others a glimpse of her weakness. That's when I decided to take things a step further. I began documenting everything, every confrontation, every letter, every instance where she tried to overstep her authority. My friends had even captured video of her storming onto my property and shouting at them, which added to the growing pile of evidence. I knew that if Karen wanted to play the legal game, I was more than prepared to finish it. My attorney and I discussed the possibility of filing not only a harassment complaint, but also pressing charges for mail fraud. At the same time, I wanted to rally the other homeowners who had suffered under her rule. If we could show a united front, Karen wouldn't stand a chance of holding on to her little kingdom. One evening, I decided to take a walk around the community. It wasn't something I usually did, but I wanted to see for myself how the other residents felt. To my surprise, many of them were eager to talk. They opened up about Karen's endless rules, her constant surveillance, and her threats of fines. Some of them even admitted they regretted ever joining the HOA, but felt trapped because leaving wasn't an easy process. I listened carefully, offering reassurance that they weren't alone anymore. Slowly, I could see the spark of hope in their eyes. Karen's power was built on fear, and now that fear was beginning to crumble. Karen, however, wasn't about to back down without a fight. A few days later, she appeared on my porch with a smug look and another stack of papers. She waved them in my face, declaring that she had the full support of the HOA board and that they were prepared to take me to court if I didn't comply with their demands. I didn't even bother to read the papers this time. Instead, I calmly told her that her actions had already been reported to my attorney and that any further harassment would only make her situation worse. The confidence in my voice seemed to catch her off guard, and for a moment, she faltered. But then, in typical Karen fashion, she tried to cover her insecurity with bluster, threatening that I would regret underestimating her. She stormed off again, but I could tell the cracks in her armor were growing wider. Later that week, I received a call from my attorney with some good news. After reviewing Karen's fraudulent letter and her repeated attempts to assert authority over my property, he believed we had a solid case to not only shut her down legally, but also potentially sue her for damages. It was exactly the leverage I needed. But instead of rushing into a lawsuit, I wanted Karen to feel the weight of her own crumbling empire first. I wanted her to see that the people she thought she controlled were no longer afraid of her. Opportunity came during the next HOA meeting, which Karen, of course, chaired. I decided to attend not because I was a member, but because I owned the land many of them lived on, and legally, I had the right to be there. When I walked into the room, heads turned, whispers spread, and Karen's face went pale. She tried to maintain her composure, but I could see the panic in her eyes. I sat quietly as she began her usual routine of rattling off fines, forcing petty rules, and belittling anyone who questioned her. But this time, the homeowners weren't so quick to back down. Emboldened by my presence, several of them began to push back. They asked for proof of the rules she claimed to enforce, demanded transparency with the HOA's finances, and questioned her authority to make unilateral decisions. Karen grew flustered, her voice rising as she tried to reassert control, but the tide was turning against her. Finally, when Karen tried to cite her authority over my property, I stood up and calmly addressed the room. I revealed to everyone that not only was I not a member of the HOA, but I was, in fact, the landlord of the land she herself lived on. The gasp that rippled through the room was followed by stunned silence. Karen's jaw dropped, and for once, she had no words. I explained clearly that her harassment had crossed into legal territory, that I had been documenting every step, and that I was fully prepared to take action if it continued. The room erupted into murmurs, and for the first time, Karen looked small-cornered, exposed, and powerless. It was a turning point, but I knew the battle wasn't over yet. Karen might have been shaken, but people like her didn't just give up. She would regroup, she would scheme, and she would come back. But now, she wasn't just fighting me, she was fighting a community that was beginning to see her for who she really was. And that realization gave me all the resolve I needed to see this through to the very end. The next morning arrived with a quiet heaviness, the type of silence that blankets the air after a storm. Except the storm in this case wasn't weather. It was the constant harassment that Karen had dragged into my life through her fake HOA power trip. I woke early as I usually did and stood on my porch overlooking the lake. The mist hovered over the water, soft and calm, a sharp contrast to the chaos Karen had been brewing. My phone buzzed with messages, mostly from neighbors thanking me for standing up to her after she called the cops, and a few anonymous ones accusing me of ruining the harmony of the neighborhood. I had a good guess those came from Karen's circle of loyalists, but it didn't matter. What mattered was how I was going to finish this fight once and for all. She had embarrassed herself enough, but if left unchecked, she'd keep pushing until she either controlled everything or destroyed it trying. I wasn't going to give her that chance. Later that day, I headed to town to meet with my attorney, a sharp woman named Rebecca, who had been handling property disputes for over 2 decades. I explained the situation from the beginning: Karen's attempt to coerce me into her HOA, her threats, her repeated intrusions, and the fact that she'd even gone so far as to call the cops on me when I declined. Rebecca listened carefully, her pen scratching across her notepad as I spoke. When I was done, she leaned back, tapping the end of her pen against the pad. "She's operating without authority," she said. "If she's been collecting dues or making demands in the name of an HOA that doesn't actually govern this land, that could be fraud. And since you're technically her landlord, that adds another layer of legal complication for her. She doesn't have a leg to stand on." Hearing that made my chest feel lighter. But Rebecca wasn't done. "You need to gather every bit of evidence you can: messages, letters, even witness statements from neighbors. If she tries to escalate this, we'll be ready. Trust me, if she thinks she can bully you into joining her little empire, she's got another thing coming." When I got home, I started organizing everything I had. Karen had left several notices stuffed into my mailbox, each one demanding that I comply with some nonsense rule about landscaping or boat docking. I had saved every one, a text from her number, each one dripping with condescension and threats of fines. I even had a video from the night she barged onto my dock, screaming at my guests to leave the lake. My neighbors who witnessed it promised they'd back me up. Slowly, I was building a case that showed just how far Karen had crossed the line, but Karen wasn't sitting still. That evening, as I was grilling dinner, I saw her walking the property line with 2 other people from her so-called board. They carried clipboards and were pointing at my yard, whispering to each other like a pack of vultures. I set my tongs down and walked over. "Can I help you?" I asked, my tone calm but sharp. Karen crossed her arms, her chin tilting up. "We're conducting an inspection," she said. "Your grass is above regulation height, your fence is not HOA approved, and your dock needs to be repainted." I stared at her, incredulous. "Inspection? On my private land? Karen, you have no authority here. You know that?" Her face flushed, but she didn't back down. "If you refuse to comply, I'll have no choice but to issue fines." That was the last straw. "Karen," I said firmly, "this isn't your kingdom. This isn't your HOA. And if you set foot on my property again without permission, I'll call the sheriff and file trespassing charges. You understand me?" The 2 board members shifted nervously, clearly uncomfortable with how far Karen was pushing it. She huffed, muttered something under her breath, and stormed off with them trailing behind. The following day, the sheriff himself stopped by my property. He was a tall, weathered man with a steady presence who had clearly seen enough neighborhood squabbles in his time. "Got another complaint from Karen?" he said with a sigh as he stood on my porch. "She claims you're refusing to follow HOA rules." I couldn't help but laugh, though there was no humor in it. "Sheriff, you know as well as I do that this land is private. I own it outright, and she has no jurisdiction here. I'm her landlord, for crying out loud." The sheriff nodded, his lips twitching in what might have been a smile. "I know, I've told her more than once, but she's stubborn, and she doesn't like being told no. What she's doing is harassment, plain and simple. If you want to press charges, I'll back you up." I told him I wasn't ready for that yet, but I appreciated his honesty. It was good to know at least one authority figure saw through Karen's charade. That evening, I decided to pay Karen a visit not to argue, but to make my position clear once and for all. When she opened the door, her expression twisted at the sight of me. "What do you want?" she snapped. I kept my voice steady. "Karen, this has to stop. You've called the cops on me, you've harassed my guests, and you've tried to impose fake rules on property you don't control. If you keep pushing, I'll have no choice but to take legal action. You don't want that, trust me." For a moment I thought I saw a flicker of doubt in her eyes, but it was gone as quickly as it came. "You think you can scare me?" she sneered. "I built this community. People respect me. You're just a stubborn outsider who doesn't know how things work." I shook my head, tired of the same delusion. "We'll see who people respect when the truth comes out," I said, then walked away before she could respond. The truth was her grip on the community was slipping. Neighbors had started approaching me, quietly expressing their frustration with Karen's antics. Some admitted they only paid her dues because they were afraid of retaliation. Others said they were tired of her rules and fines. One older couple even confessed that they were considering moving because of how unbearable she'd made life near the lake. It was becoming clear that Karen wasn't the beloved leader she imagined herself to be. She was a tyrant, and people were getting tired of her reign. Rebecca, my attorney, called me a few days later with good news. "I've reviewed everything you've sent me," she said, "and I've spoken to the county office. Legally, Karen's HOA has no claim over your property. She's been overstepping her boundaries, and if she continues, we can file an injunction against her for harassment and trespassing. You hold the cards here." That was the reassurance I needed. The thought of finally putting an end to Karen's reign of intimidation filled me with determination. But Karen, in her endless stubbornness, wasn't ready to back down. The next weekend, as I was hosting a small gathering by the lake, she showed up again, this time with a bullhorn in hand, shouting at my guests to leave because they were violating HOA regulations. It was ridiculous, almost comical, but my guests were visibly uncomfortable. I stood up, walked over to her, and calmly took the bullhorn out of her hand. "Karen," I said loudly enough for everyone to hear, "this is my private property. This is my land. You have no authority here. If you don't leave right now, I'll have the sheriff escort you off." The crowd of neighbors who had gathered nearby murmured in agreement, some even clapping. For the first time, Karen looked around and realized she didn't have the support she thought she did. Her face turned beet red, and without another word, she stormed off. It was a small victory, but it was also a turning point. The illusion of her control was cracking, and the more she pushed, the more people saw her for who she really was. I knew it wasn't over yet. Karen wasn't the type to surrender quietly, and I had a feeling her next move would be desperate. What she didn't know was that I was ready for her, and this time, I wouldn't just defend myself. I would make sure her reign of harassment came to an end once and for all. The morning after the chaos of Karen's failed HOA coup felt eerily calm compared to the storm that had been raging for weeks. But calmness didn't mean the story was over. It was just the beginning of the final chapter, where truth would bury all her lies. I woke to find dozens of text messages and emails from neighbors who had once been silent or too afraid to speak, now thanking me for standing up to Karen and her abusive antics. Some even admitted they had secretly hoped someone would finally hold her accountable. But fear of retaliation had kept them quiet. It wasn't just about me anymore. This was about restoring balance to an entire neighborhood that had been terrorized by a self-appointed tyrant. As I sat on my porch sipping coffee, I knew that the final showdown was coming, because Karen was not the type to walk away quietly, especially not when her ego had been shattered in front of the very people she claimed to control. But what Karen didn't know was that I had been preparing for this day long before she ever called the cops on me. Every encounter, every threat, every stunt she pulled had been documented, not just by me, but by the people around me who were tired of her reign of intimidation. What she thought was her moment of power was really her downfall in slow motion, and I was ready to pull the final thread. By noon, the sheriff's deputy, who had dealt with Karen's last false report, stopped by my cabin to let me know that the county had officially filed charges against her. Her repeated misuse of 911, harassment, and trespassing had crossed the line into criminal behavior. The deputy told me that, given her history, there was a strong chance she would face court-mandated restrictions, possibly even jail time. When I asked if that meant she'd be forced to step down from her HOA board position, the deputy smirked and said, "Oh, she won't be able to step down because the entire board is under investigation now. You may have just exposed more corruption than you realized." That statement lit a fire in me, because I had suspected for some time that Karen wasn't acting alone. She might have been the loudest, most obnoxious face of the HOA, but power, like hers, usually came from an enabler or two lurking in the background. Sure enough, the deputy explained that the county attorney's office had launched a full inquiry into the HOA's finances. Things weren't adding up. Misused funds, unexplained fees, and shady contracts were all coming to light. It turned out Karen's harassment of me wasn't just about forcing me into the HOA. It was about silencing anyone who might uncover what they'd been hiding for years. I felt a surge of both anger and satisfaction. This woman had tried to bully me into submission, but her arrogance had blinded her to the fact that I wasn't just another resident cowering under her threats. I was her landlord. I owned the land beneath her house, and now she was about to lose everything because she underestimated me. That evening, I walked down to the lake where it all began, the same place where she had screamed at my guests, called the cops on me, and tried to claim authority she never had. The sun was setting, casting gold across the water, and for the first time in weeks, I felt peace, knowing the end was near. As I stood there, I saw neighbors approaching one by one. Some came with baked goods, others with thank you cards, and a few just wanted to shake my hand. One older man told me he had lived here for 20 years and had never seen anyone stand up to the HOA like I did. "You gave us our freedom back," he said, and his words struck me more deeply than I expected. It wasn't just about winning a fight with Karen, it was about proving that bullies lose when good people refuse to back down. Of course, Karen wasn't done yet. That night, she made one last desperate attempt to cling to power. She stormed onto my property again, this time with a group of her die-hard supporters, holding signs that read, "HOA rules keep us safe and join or leave." They chanted outside my cabin like some kind of bizarre protest, trying to intimidate me into backing off. But the difference this time was that the majority of the neighborhood had turned against her, and within minutes, a countercrowd formed. My supporters outnumbered hers 3-1, and they shouted her down, demanding she leave me alone. The sheriff's deputies soon arrived, and instead of targeting me as they once had, they marched straight toward Karen when she tried to argue. Claiming this was a peaceful protest, one deputy handed her a court summons. Her face turned pale as she read the charges, and for the first time, Karen had nothing to say. The crowd fell silent as she was escorted away, her shouts drowned out by the sound of neighbors cheering. That moment was the turning point, though. The tyrant had fallen, and the neighborhood was finally free. In the weeks that followed, the county dissolved the corrupt HOA board. Investigators uncovered years of mismanagement, and several members were fined heavily for their involvement. Karen herself faced multiple misdemeanor charges and a civil lawsuit from the county for abusing her position. The irony was almost poetic. The woman who had once prided herself on being the self-proclaimed queen of the lake was now a pariah. Her reputation ruined, her influence destroyed. Meanwhile, life on the lake began to heal. Families started holding barbecues again. Kids played on the shoreline without being told they were breaking imaginary rules. And neighbors who hadn't spoken in years found common ground in their shared relief that Karen was gone. I repaired the small dock she once tried to claim, and I made it open for any neighbor who wanted to fish or swim. I wanted to set an example that the lake wasn't a weapon of control, but a shared blessing that could bring people together, instead of driving them apart. One afternoon, as I watched a group of kids laughing in the water, I realized how much had changed. Karen's downfall wasn't just about justice. It was about liberation. It proved that one person with courage could inspire an entire community to break free from oppression. And as for me, I no longer worried about her threats or schemes. She was gone, and the lake was mine again, not because I fought for it, but because I refused to surrender it. In that moment, I thought back to the first day she ever confronted me on this land, her voice shrill, her words dripping with entitlement. She thought she could break me with fear, but all she did was ignite a fire she couldn't put out. Here's the truth. HOA Karens like her thrive on silence, but when you speak up and you stand your ground, they crumble faster than they rise. If you've ever dealt with someone like Karen, you know the power they try to wield is nothing compared to the strength of owning your truth. I share this story with you not just to show how one battle was won, but to remind you that your voice matters. Never let someone convince you they own what's rightfully yours. Never let bullies dictate the terms of your life. And always remember that courage is contagious. And if this story fired you up, if you believe in standing up to Karens and HOAs who think they're untouchable, then don't just walk away now. Stay with me, because I've got more battles, more victories, and more stories that will keep you on the edge of your seat. Hit that subscribe button to Sham Stories right now, because the fight against Karen may be over. But the fight for justice in neighborhoods everywhere has just begun. The fallout from that explosive night at the town hall reverberated through every corner of the Lake community. And Karen found herself in an unfamiliar position, islanded, watched and trapped by the very neighbors she once controlled with. Threats and intimidation, while I was left in the center of the storm. Both admired for standing my ground, and despised by those who had hitched their wagon to her schemes. And I knew that if I wanted this battle to end once and for all, I needed to take steps beyond proving ownership or humiliating her publicly. I needed to dismantle the machinery she had built piece by piece so it could never rise again, because Karen wasn't simply an annoying neighbor anymore. She was a manipulator who had leveraged fear, misinformation, and a distorted idea of power to control her surroundings. And people like that didn't stop because they lost a single round. They regrouped, they schemed harder, and they tried again. So my job wasn't to win once, it was to make it impossible for her to ever try again. And I started with the neighbors who had suffered under her shadow for too long, knocking on doors, sitting on porches, listening to their stories of harassment, intimidation, false citations, and in some cases, blatant trespassing, collecting testimony after testimony until I had a binder thick enough to rival any lawsuit. And when people saw me listening, really listening, their walls broke. They started sharing evidence they had hidden away in fear. Emails from Karen, letters on fake HOA letterhead, pictures of her on their property, and even recordings of her shouting threats through doors. And with every page I added to my binder, the more unstoppable the case became. But I also realized something deeper. These neighbors didn't just want Karen gone. They wanted justice, closure, a moment where they could finally breathe without watching their backs. And that pushed me further, because I wasn't fighting her only for me anymore. I was fighting for all of us. And when I handed that thick binder over to my attorney and watched his eyes widen page by page, I knew I had struck gold, because his response was immediate. "This isn't just civil, some of this is criminal," he said, tapping a recording transcript where Karen blatantly threatened to ruin someone's life if they didn't comply with her made-up HOA fees. And that was the moment the gears of justice began to turn faster than Karen could keep up with. Because while she spent her time screaming in community group chats and gossiping about me at the local cafe, the wheels of law and order were spinning behind her back, and by the time she realized the ground was shifting beneath her feet, it was too late to scramble, too late to try another trick, and too late to regain her illusion of control. And in those weeks while investigations deepened, I focused on strengthening my ties with the community. Hosting open barbecue weekends by the lake where everyone could come without fear of Karen barging in. Children splashing in the water, elderly couples laughing as they shared stories on picnic benches. Teenagers roasting marshmallows, and the energy was electric, healing. It was what the lake was meant to be, private land meant for joy, not for control. And people began to see me not just as the landlord or the man who stood up to Karen, but as a protector of that peace, someone who truly cared. And that bond became my greatest weapon, because while Karen worked by division, I worked by unity. And unity always wins in the long run. Yet I knew Karen wasn't done, not entirely, because she still lurked, making snide comments on social media, trying to spin the narrative that I was some tyrant land baron controlling the neighborhood. And though her words grew weaker with every passing week, I refused to underestimate her, because people like Karen were like snakes, waiting in the grass for the right moment to strike again. And sure enough, one evening, as the sun dipped orange over the lake, I received word that Karen had made a final desperate move. She filed a lawsuit, not against me personally, but against several of my tenants and neighbors, accusing them of breaking community rules that didn't exist, harassing her with complaints, trespassing on common property, which she laughably included the lake itself in her filing. And while most of us laughed at the absurdity, I didn't let my guard down, because a desperate person with a pen and false confidence can still cause damage. But this time, she had overplayed her hand, because when the court reviewed her claims, they immediately flagged inconsistencies. And that's when my attorney dropped the binder of evidence on the judge's desk. Flipping it open to those damning recordings, those fake HOA letters, those photographs of Karen trespassing and threatening others, by the time the hearing adjourned, the look on Karen's face said that all the walls had finally closed in, not with shouts, not with public embarrassment, but with cold, undeniable law, and the once feared HOA president was now facing a potential restraining order, fines and investigations that could strip away the last remnants of her credibility. And as we walked out of the courthouse that day, the neighbors, who once whispered in fear, now walked tall, shoulders back, smiling, as if years of weight had been lifted from them, and I couldn't help but feel the same, though I knew the final act wasn't yet complete. Because endings matter, they shape memory, and I wanted Karen's ending in this community to be a lesson no one would ever forget. Not out of cruelty, but to make sure no one like her ever rose again. So I began planning one last event, a grand lakeside gathering, bigger than any barbecue, inviting everyone in the area to celebrate not just victory but freedom, decorating the shoreline with lanterns, setting up music, food, games. And when the night arrived, it was magical. The lake shimmered with lights, laughter carried across the water. And for once, there was no fear of Karen storming in, because she was barred legally from setting foot anywhere near us. And as I stood on the dock, watching the people I had fought for enjoy what was theirs, I felt a satisfaction deeper than personal pride. It was the satisfaction of justice done right, of peace restored, of a battle truly won not by might alone, but by patience, persistence, and the courage to stand tall against the loudest bully in the room. And I knew in that moment the final act was just around the corner, the conclusion that would cement Karen's fall and remind everyone who had once trembled at her name that she was no longer a threat, but just a cautionary tale of arrogance destroyed by truth. And I was ready to close that chapter once and for all.